Okay, AP Euro, here we go. This is Mr. Side. We're talking about the unification of Italy and Germany. First, here's what I want you to focus on. In this quick vodcast, we're going to talk about the importance of nationalism and how conservative forces will actually be the ones taking control of it. We'll talk briefly about Realpolitik, which is a way of political action that's taken by people like Bismarck and Cavour. We'll focus mainly on the power of diplomacy in setting up the unifications, the key steps involved in the process, and who we want to know is involved. Ultimately, we'll be looking at how these unifications change Europe, so what the consequences of these are going to be. In terms of nationalism, we'll see that in Italy, the Risorgimento will involve countless setbacks, but will ultimately come to fruition. We'll see how Napoleon helped to reignite a spirit of German nationalism during his occupation there. And we'll look at how conservatives will be the ones yoking the strength of nationalism by gaining the support of the masses, much to the chagrin of liberal factions. Okay, let's talk about diplomacy. This is an age in which diplomacy is in full effect. We will see that the actions taken by some countries or not taken by some countries helps to shape the course of events. We're going to look at how some countries are going to hold grudges against one another. Let's use the Crimean War for an example. In the Crimean War, France and Britain joined the forces with the Ottoman Empire to kind of keep Russia in check. People were afraid of Russia's expansion into warm water ports and their expansion into parts of Europe. Russia's not going to forget how France acted towards them. So let's say when the day and age comes for the Franco-Prussian War, Russia will sit on the sidelines. Sardinia is going to utilize France and their conflict with Austria, and this will help Italian unification shape up. So we'll see, this is an age in which there will be a unique web of treaties, both public and private. However, I must stress here and sort of lay some of the foreshadowing that, as you guys remember from World War I, these secret treaties are some of the main culprits of the conflict. Now on to Realpolitik, something practiced and perfected by Otto Von Bismarck. It's very simple, very straightforward, almost what politics should be about. About making a decision that's in the best interest of a nation or of the power of the leaders of that nation. You're doing things that are practical. You're getting what you can get. You're not trying to get too much more. You're not being idealistic. You're not an ideologue. You're not simply thinking about violence, oppression, or doing things without implying moral ethics. Everything is calculated. Everything has a purpose. On to Italy. Here we have a pretty colorful map of Italian unification. Now might be a good moment to either pause and reflect on previous learning that we've done, or take some time to look at how this map unfolds. You'll notice that things happen in a sequence, and we'll talk about that sequence in the next few minutes. Here are the major players involved in Italian unification. We'll see Cavour, known as the Brain, Garibaldi, known as the Sword, Mazzini, who we'll deal with first, who's known as the Heart, and ultimately Victor Emmanuel, who will be the king, the monarch, that theoretically is in control of all of these Italian states. Now, the spirit of Risorgimento had been around for quite a while. One of the first movements we have are the Carbonari insurrections, and these are taking place in the 1820s. This is an association of coal workers that had sort of spread into a secret society. They were influenced to a certain degree by the French Revolution and many of its purposes. This leads revolts in the 1820s and the 1830s. One of the members of these associations was a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini is known as the spirit, sort of the forefather of Italian nationalism. He He's going to form a particular group called Young Italy, which will spread its wings into other nations around Europe. And he will inspire revolutions in the 1830s and the 1840s, even for a time occupying Rome until France restores order. The man is very popular, but he's never able to really take full control of any of these states. Once the Pope was threatened because of these nationalist uprisings, you're going to see a great divide exist between the papacy and Italian nationalists, and this divide will exist all the way into the day and age of actually Mussolini in the 1920s. Cavour, known as the Brains, who's the Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, and in this podcast you'll hear me talking about Sardinia and Piedmont interchangeably. I apologize if I do so, but anytime I'm talking about Sardinia, I'm also talking about Piedmont, so please keep that in mind. Cavour was very much a modern-looking conservative leader. He recognized the importance of a strong and sound economy. And he knew that the only way that, Piedmont, Sardinia, which is sort of the little engine that could, well, the only way that that little engine was going to expand and become more powerful was going to be through progress. Railroads, free trade, industrialization, liberalized religious tolerance, and some forms of representative government. He's not throwing the right to vote to everybody, but he's including many, many more people than had been involved in the past. He has some very clear objectives. He wants control over northern Italy, and he wants to make Sardinia an important European power. He's not so much interested in the South, as we'll find later. The South is mostly agrarian, it's very backward, it's very poor at this time, and is not in his immediate plans. We'll see Cavour orchestrating the rise of Piedmont, Sardinia. He does this by getting Sardinia involved in the Crimean War. And in return, by sending some troops to the Crimea, he gets Piedmont, Sardinia at the negotiating table. This gives him an in with Napoleon III, who he's able to sort of meet with years later and make some deals. And he gains French support for Austria, for the Sardinians, the Piedmont Sardinians, against Austria, because as Piedmont Sardinia is expanding, they're gonna earn sort of the dirty eye, the evil look from Austria. Austria does not want a unified Italy and will take steps to prevent it from expanding. This leads ultimately to the Austro-Sardinian War in 1859. France does come to support Sardinia, but will ultimately make a separate peace. And we see from the map here that ultimately in 1859, the Sardinians will get Lombardy, but they don't get all the things they want immediately because the French sign a separate peace with Austria. Piedmont, as I said, gets Lombardy, but nothing more at the time. The French also recognize the growing power of Piedmont and don't want to move too quickly to have to deal with another powerful state on their southern border. But what you have to understand is that for every consequence, there are more consequences. And many northern Italian states were also looking to become part of Piedmont, Sardinia. And as the Piedmontese troops were rallying through the streets of these various different places on their way back from the conflicts, the people of these northern Italian states rally around the spirit of unification. In the melee that follows, many of the lords or the sort of the cronies of Austria who have been ruling these northern states flee in terror, flee in fear for their lives. The assemblies that take control of these northern states quickly get together. They vote to join Piedmont, Sardinia, and we get a new united northern Italy, something that Cavour had only dreamed of years before. Now, in exchange for recognition of this state of being, Piedmont, Sardinia, now the sort of unified northern Italian state, will give France Nice and Savoy. These are territories that they had held in the past. France will accept this united Italy for the time being. Austria is forced to sort of sit and watch as this is going on. And it leads to the next step, which is the man of the hour, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi is known as the Sword. He's the most famous hero in all of Italy. This is a man who has, is a heartbreaker, is a lover, leaving behind many mistresses on multiple continents. There are statues of him all throughout Italy and South America. We'll find that this guy had been involved in many of the uprisings in the 1830s, the 1840s. He's forced to flee. He was actually very famous for his defense of Rome until it ultimately was taken over by the French. He had spent a lot of time the previous 10 years leading revolutions throughout South America, and he had gained quite a reputation. He's most famous, though, for leading his army of the red shirts, this sort of 1,000-man, ragtag army of sort of semi-untrained middle-class individuals who will land in Sicily, and much to the surprise of the generals there, outmaneuver much larger forces in Sicily and in southern Italy. He will be so popular that in all the towns that he goes to, his ranks grow and grow and grow. Ultimately, he's able to take all of southern Italy. Now, this is a very positive thing for most Italians, but see, this leads us back to Cavour, the brains of the operations. While Garibaldi is the sword, Cavour is the brains, and he recognizes that if the Italians push too hard on this issue, the French or the Austrians or both forces will come to put their boot down very quickly. So Cavour moves to calm the situation. He sends his forces to meet Garibaldi. It leads to a very famous event where Garibaldi, recognizing what's at stake, recognizing the importance of the moment, yields his forces to King Victor Emmanuel, as we see illustrated in both of these paintings here in illustrations. When Garibaldi's forces link up with the forces of Victor Emmanuel, we are 90% of the way towards Italian unification. The last two steps take place in 1866 and 1870, and it's interesting that they occur because of German unification. You see, as the Germans are fighting the Austrians in 1866 and later the French in 1870, there are opportunities for the Italians to get involved, and because of their participation in the Austro-Prussian War, they're able to annex and take over territories of Venetia. In 1870, the French need all the help they can get against the Prussians. French forces leave Rome to get back to the main battlefields in France, opening the door for Italian troops to walk in and take over Rome. These are the final steps in Italian unification. So why does any of this matter? Why should we care about Italian unification? What are the consequences? Well, first off, the impossible, or the seemingly impossible, has transpired. This entire course we've looked at a disjointed, non-unified Italian state that actually comes together, politically at least, for the first time since the Roman Empire. There'll be a little bit of stress on the balance of power, not anywhere near as much as the unification of Germany, but certainly it does change things. Italy is still a little bit out of whack. The North and South are almost non-compatible with one another. The North is very much industrial, the South is very much agrarian. There's great inequality and backwardness throughout the country. Nevertheless, Italy is unified. Now is a great moment before we get into German unification for you to pause and reflect upon what you've learned. Now that you've taken a few minutes to pause and think about the key consequences of Italian unification, let's now look at the much bigger event of the time period, and that is certainly the unification of Germany through Prussia. This comes about very simply. It comes about because of Otto von Bismarck. His work, both in raising an even bigger and stronger army than the Prussians had already had, and through his skillful diplomacy, we will see Germany come to be. They will fight wars with the Danes, with the Austrians, and finally with the French, all the while isolating their enemies and keeping other forces from intervening. All this takes place because of one man, Otto von Bismarck. Who is Otto von Bismarck? Who was he? Why is he so important? These are the questions they will seek to answer in the next few minutes. Bismarck is certainly one of the most influential leaders in all of history, but certainly in the 19th century. He's by far the most influential German in the time between Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler. He comes to dominate Prussian and later German politics until his dismissal in 1890. He practiced Realpolitik, as we had argued earlier before. He's very much a conservative. He is anti-liberal, but he will make concessions because he's a Realpolitik. He will do what he has to do to be practical and pragmatic. In his famous Iron and Blood speech, which hopefully this class has already read, he discusses how Germany will be united not by constitutions, not by negotiations, but by being strong. Blood and iron represents industrialization and war. These are the steps, these are the building blocks towards unification. Bismarck, seen here in a military-style uniform, never actually served in the military, but always wore a uniform, which is always quite interesting. It was fashionable to do so in that day and age. He comes from the Junker classes, the Junker classes. These are the nobles in Prussia. He was a landholder from East Prussia. Spent most of his younger days drinking and dueling. It's sort of who he was. He was very much a feisty individual, great debater. And he will be the man orchestrating German unification. It's important to understand as we move towards the steps towards unification here that Bismarck is not a king, he's a chancellor. Like Cavour, he's a prime minister. And he is the chancellor, right, for Wilhelm I, or Wilhelm, you'll see it spelled either way. And ultimately, this is a monarchy. This is a conservative monarchy that Bismarck is able to run. A couple things that happened prior to the wars. Germany unifies because of 3 wars, but there are things that were already in place. One was the Zollverein, which is a customs union. It was a tax union. It was an economic association of German states. Austria was not part of this. And because of that, Prussia comes to dominate the association and create very vital and important links to its neighbors. We also talked about the Frankfurt Assembly, which had existed back in the 1840s, and there were a number of different ideas exchanged about how Germany could come together. When Bismarck comes to power, he understands the importance of dominating the Prussian government and exacting his will upon a very liberal legislature. An issue occurs early on in terms of funding the army. Bismarck recognizes that the army must be expanded, it must be much, much larger. He comes into a deadlock with the Liberal Assembly. He argues that in this point in time the king has the power to sort of be the tie-breaking vote. And because the nature of the Prussian people was very much an obedient kind of state of being, he just superseded the power of the legislature and went directly to the people. And he sent out his tax collectors, and the money was collected. And the army was expanded. And this is critical because it will be the power of the Prussian military that will unify Germany. It does create, however, a very nasty and very dangerous precedent. It essentially allows for the military to overrule the legislature. And as we know, Germany will become even more and more militaristic as time goes on, certainly in World War I, and definitely, as we all know under the Nazi regime of World War II. And this precedent is established here, and it's dangerous. Okay, quickly, you could pause here and take a look at Germany sort of before unification. It's the purple piece. We'll see various wars will add elements onto it. Okay. Step 1. War with Denmark. Okay. Denmark had essentially held high influence over some of the northern provinces of Schleswig and Holstein, and now had looked to annex some of these territories. Bismarck is able to sort of convince Austria to join them in stopping this process. But because Prussia gets a piece and Austria gets a piece, you know it's going to lead to some wars and some conflict. And certainly 2 years later, after this conflict is over, we see trouble brewing between Prussia and Austria. The most important thing to understand about this war, which lasts only about 7 weeks, this war between Austria and Prussia, is that it is quick. It's quick because the Prussians are more advanced than the Austrians, but that in the end, diplomacy and Bismarck has the good judgment here to be diplomatic in the peace. So there's no major indemnity paid by Austria to Prussia. There's no major territories taken from Austria. Austria just simply recognizes that they are now sort of out of the running to unify the German states. Notice here that Russia, France, and Italy all have something to gain by staying out of the conflict. Bismarck goes to each of the, through the diplomatic channels, to each of these places, promises them certain things. So Italy is promised Phoenicia, France is promised maybe some control over territories on the Rhine. Russia does not forget the embarrassing defeat at the hands of the French and others during the Crimea. And so Bismarck is able to isolate the Austrians. Both the Austrians and the Prussians knew this war was coming. Prussia uses an excuse to invade Holstein, and before you know it, this war is kind of over. The Prussian armies pour into Austria, utilizing railroads, advanced artillery, repeating rifles, the telegraph. Many of these skills were learned by observing the American Civil War, because notice, the American Civil War, as we know, ends in 1865. The Prussians had been studying much of what was going on. This conflict takes place a little while later. In the aftermath, we see Prussia taking control of any territory that sort of helped Austria out during these conflicts, but does very intelligently and very prudently avoid humiliating Austria. And a new North German Confederation that Prussia controls is created in 1867. So we've had war with Denmark, we've had war with Austria. All this sets up the showdown with France. And in 1870, a little bit earlier, Bismarck gets his chance. There had been an issue over who was going to take the throne in Spain. Once again, Spain comes up. It's very similar to the War of Spanish Succession in the day and age of Louis XVI, except in this case, the Prussians win. Essentially, there's a Hohenzollern, right, a relative of the Kaiser, talked about as taking over the throne. France protests, and the Germans back off. A French ambassador meets the Kaiser at a sort of a spa location, a kind of retreat at a place called Ems, and the king apologizes, in essence, to Napoleon III, and this is documented in a telegram from Wilhelm to the French ambassador. Bismarck gets a hold of this and makes a few edits. He doesn't necessarily add anything to the letter, but he sort of erases a few things to shape the argument as if Wilhelm, instead of apologizing, is really kind of insulting France and Napoleon III. Now let's remember our discussions about Napoleon III. Napoleon III thinks he's Napoleon I, and this is a day and age when he's looking to show the rest of Europe that France has arrived. And so he declares war on the Prussians. The Prussians kick butt and take names, if you will. And as we see in this image on the right here, there's a lasting memory of German soldiers sort of, exacting abuse upon the French. This will not be forgotten. This will lead us all the way into World War I. and be the catalyst for modern conflicts. France is not prepared for this war. They do not have the technological capability of the Prussians. The Prussians have only fine-tuned their armed forces since their conflict with Austria. The war lasts about 6 months, with the most overwhelming defeat for the French coming out of a place called Sedan, where almost 100,000 French troops were taken. More importantly, Napoleon III himself is captured on the battlefield and becomes a prisoner. The Second Empire, the second empire of Napoleon, collapses overnight. Paris is under siege and is essentially starved out and starved into submission. Legend has it that the streets and the zoos were free from any animals residing within it. The rats disappeared, the animals disappeared, until nothing was left. There is even some talk that cannibalism occurred. In the end, the French are defeated. It is a complete embarrassment for everyone involved. The Second Empire collapses. The Italians are able to take Rome because French troops had to flee. France is stuck with a huge indemnity, a huge war debt, occupied by the French, and equally embarrassing, they lose Alsace-Lorraine, where some of my ancestors actually come from, which was, essentially a German/French territory. And debates over who really controlled that territory goes back for a long time. But more importantly, it was an industrially rich area, which will now go to the Germans. And if you notice on the bottom of the screen, I put down that angry France will not forget. There are men who will fight in this conflict. Someone like Clemenceau of France, who will be involved in the negotiations of Versailles after World War I. There's a whole generation of young men who will not forget this humiliating defeat and will vow to exact revenge upon Germany. And this will last all the way through World War I. If we look at this image here, we can understand why. What you're looking at is a famous painting where Kaiser Wilhelm, or Kaiser William I, is crowned. This takes place in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles inside of France. Imagine how embarrassed you would be if you were a Frenchman and years later you saw this painting. In the middle, in a white coat, we see Bismarck standing between the people, the army, and his king, Kaiser Wilhelm I. This will not be tolerated by the French. They will not forget. We will see the impact of this years later. In conclusion, understand that a new militarily and economically powerful Prussia has now turned into a unified, militarily and powerful Germany. The liberals will have lost ground because you'll see many conservative authoritarian states emerge, particularly in Germany. France and Austria have become weakened. We will see a definite blow to French-German relations, where the French will now be fearful and always have their eyes turned on Germany. Relations in the post-1871 years will be very much poisoned territory. Austria will actually come closer to to Germany, and we will see certain lines being drawn that will lead us to World War I. Well, I hope you learned a lot today, and I hope this has been useful for you. We will continue our discussions on a later point in time. Here I give special thanks to various resources I've utilized in the creation of this presentation. Take care.